The Battle of Biak, fought between the United States Army and the Imperial Japanese Army from the 27th of May to the 17th of August 1944, is perhaps one of the more widely overlooked and lesser-known battles of the Pacific War that marked a significant milestone in the Allied push to recapture New Guinea. Biak Island, situated near the western end of New Guinea, just northwest of the Allied stronghold at Hollandia, was the next step in General Douglas MacArthur's relentless march towards recapturing the Philippines. The primary objective for the Allied forces would be to seize the three Japanese-held airfields located on the island, those being Mokmar, Borokoe, and Sorito airfields, which all sat within relative proximity to each other, located near Biak's northern and eastern shores. Initially, Allied intelligence had anticipated a swift one-week operation, underestimating the strength of the Japanese forces on the island. They had calculated that there were no more than 4,400 defending troops, though the actual number was more than double, totaling 11,000 men, with the majority of combat troops charged with the defence being composed of the battle-hardened 222nd Infantry Regiment, which had previously served in China. Occupied by the Japanese since early 1942, Biak was heavily fortified to withstand potential attacks, serving as a key military stronghold during the early to mid stages of the Second World War. In the lead-up to the invasion, the commander of Japanese forces at Biak, Colonel Kazumi Naoki, displayed a departure from previous tactics of forming a concentrated assault at the water's edge that had been seen in previous engagements against the Americans. Rather than opposing the initial landings, Kazumi would allow the Americans to come ashore unopposed, directing his forces to transform the high mountain areas surrounding the vital airfields into a complex network of cave systems and fortified positions, filled with riflemen, automatic weapons, artillery, and batteries of mortars, well stocked with enough ammunition, water and food to sustain a prolonged defence for months. This marked the first significant instance of the Japanese strategy to create a kill zone inland, a tactic that would later be replicated in numerous defensive battles. On the 27th of May 1944, the Allied invasion began, with the 41st Division of the United States Army landing at Biak, initially with the 162nd Infantry Regiment, and soon followed by the remainder of the division. They would also be accompanied by some Australian troops, who would mainly provide artillery support and logistical assistance. By the evening, 12,000 American troops had landed, supported by 12 Sherman tanks, 29 field guns, and over 500 other assorted vehicles. The first engagement with the Japanese would be a brief attack on the beachhead by a group of Type 95 light tanks that were quickly neutralized by the American M4 Shermans. Afterwards, the Americans began to move inland, quietly confident and expecting little opposition. As they advanced towards the airfields, the Americans came within 200 meters of their first objective, when suddenly, from the low-lying terrain and surrounding ridges, came a barrage of heavy weapons fire that pinned them down. It was not until dark that amphibious tractors could be brought in to rescue the stranded Americans, transporting them back to the main beachhead. On May 31st, the 41st Division's 3rd Regiment and the 163rd landed at Biak, after being withdrawn from the Wakadi-Sama battle. With these reinforcements in place, the Americans began preparations for a second offensive. The commander of American forces, General Fuller, devised a two-pronged attack strategy, with the 162nd advancing along the coast and the 186th taking the parallel route inland. This offensive would commence on June 1st, with steady progress being made throughout the day. On the night of June 1st, the Japanese would launch an assault on 3rd Battalion of the 186th Infantry. The attack would be quickly repelled, resulting in at least 86 dead Japanese, including the commander of the Japanese 222nd Infantry Regiment. The advance resumed early on June 2nd, with American forces pushing into one of the main Japanese strongpoints on the island, known as the Ibdi Pocket. Over the next 2 days, the primary focus would be on pushing the Japanese back and clearing the pocket, where the Americans encountered a heavy and determined resistance. By June 4th, the American advance had halted, as they awaited a potential counterattack, prompted by aerial reconnaissance suggesting that Japanese reinforcements were en route to Biak. However, no such attack materialized, and the Americans resumed their offensive on June 5th. On June 6th, just as the 186th Regiment was poised to assault the high ground north of Mokmar Airfield, new orders from General Fuller redirected the battalion to abandon the ridges and instead attack Mokmar Airfield and the southern beach, with General Fuller hoping to quickly seize these areas, while the Japanese were preoccupied with reinforcing other positions. The assault on the airfield was launched early on the morning of June 7th, with the Americans encountering minimal resistance during its initial capture. However, as they advanced, they now found themselves inadvertently positioned in the exact location the Japanese wanted them. At 9:45 am, a ring of Japanese machine gun and artillery fire opened from the surrounding ridges, marking the start of an all-out 4-hour bombardment. Despite managing to maintain their position on the airfield, the Americans were unable to dislodge the Japanese from the ridges, thus hindering their ability to fully utilize the airfield. Over the next 4 days, they would make little progress, although the 162nd Regiment managed to reach Mokmar Airfield to reinforce the 186th. A renewed effort to clear the area north of Mokmar Airfield commenced on June 11th, with the 162nd and the 186th Regiments advancing westward. By June 12th, they had begun the push north, and by June 14th, they had secured most of the low-lying terrain north of the airfield. By the end of June 15th, the Japanese had been pushed back into a small defensive pocket northwest of the airfield, near one of the major Japanese defensive positions, an area known as the West Caves. During the first half of June, the Japanese made 3 unsuccessful attempts to send reinforcements to Biak, all of which resulted in strategic failure, with only approximately 200 Japanese troops managing to reach the island. As frustration grew within the American High Command over the perceived slow progress at Biak, a decision was made to place General Eichelberger in charge of American forces, replacing General Fuller. Like many other commanders during the Second World War, Eichelberger took several days to assess the situation he had inherited, before opting a strategy similar to his predecessor, recognizing the importance of clearing the Japanese from the ridge north of Mokmar Airfield. The American offensive resumed on June 16th, with the 2nd Battalion of the 186th Regiment taking the lead. Encountered resistance was swiftly overcome, and the last part of the low ridge south of the West Caves was cleared within a matter of 2 hours. Progress would slow significantly after this initial push, though some progress would be made in the area overlooking the West Caves the following day. On the afternoon of June 17th, General Eichelberger opted to cancel the next phase of the attack, aiming to replenish and reorganize his forces, in preparation for a large-scale offensive. This offensive, utilizing the full strength of the 162nd and the 186th Regiments, was slated to commence on June 19th. The 186th Regiment would be tasked with leading the main assault on the West Caves, deploying 2 battalions from the west and 1 from the east. By the day's end, the reinforced American troops had encircled the West Caves, preparing for 2 subsequent operations on June 20th, one targeting the Japanese within the caves, and the other advancing into the high ground overlooking the airfields. By June 21st, the primary attack was focused on the strongest Japanese positions within the West Caves. To overcome the sections with the highest concentration of Japanese resistance, the Americans employed the strategy of pouring fuel into the caves and setting them alight. On the night of June 21st, the surviving Japanese defenders launched an attack on the American lines in a bid to flee the area, attempting 3 separate assaults, all of which were quickly repelled. On June 22nd, heavy demolition charges were used to seal the cave entrances. Over the next few days, only a small number of survivors were encountered, with the caves being declared free of enemy troops on June 27th. With the clearance of the West Caves, the final obstacle preventing the Americans operating from Mokmar Airfield had been lifted, with the first lot of P-40 fighter planes now able to commence operations from the island. The Americans would now turn their attention to capturing the remaining two airfields and removing the Japanese from their remaining pockets of resistance on the island. By this time, the Japanese had received new orders from their own 2nd Area Army Command to prepare for guerrilla warfare. Though the substantial losses they had already suffered and the consistent American patrols prevented them from complying with this directive. The initial assault to clear the East Caves commenced on July 3rd, with engineers backed by tanks closing off several tunnel entrances. As the Americans advanced further into the area, they discovered that the majority of Japanese troops had already withdrawn, though some isolated Japanese troops would continue to emerge until July 20th. Until July 28th, ongoing operations in the Ibdi Pocket continued, with the Americans gradually pushing the Japanese westward. As the Japanese continued their fierce resistance, many retreated into the jungle. The Americans would respond with a series of artillery barrages and patrols to clear the thick vegetation. On July 11th, the 3rd Battalion of the 163rd Infantry initiated a new series of manoeuvres, which lasted until July 22nd, when the battalion commander announced that there was no longer an organised Japanese resistance on Biak. By the end of July, an estimated 4,000 Japanese troops still occupied the island. In response, the Americans would conduct vigorous patrols in order to prevent any isolated attacks on their forces. The battle officially concluded on August 17, 1944, as the remaining Japanese forces on Biak scattered into the interior, now focused solely on survival, facing death from starvation and disease in the following weeks. The invasion had cost the American forces 438 killed and 2,361 wounded, while naval casualties included 22 killed, 14 missing, and 68 wounded. The Americans also suffered 7,234 non-battle casualties, primarily due to many soldiers contracting scrub typhus. The Japanese had fought to annihilation, suffering 4,700 killed, with only 200 survivors taken prisoner. Despite the unanticipated fierce resistance on Biak, American ground forces showcased severe determination and perseverance. This victory further eroded the Japanese confidence in their defensive capabilities, bringing the Allies ever closer to reclaiming New Guinea and the Philippines.